All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for Rewriting Kinship. My name's Catriona Menzies Pike. I'm the editor of the Sydney Review of Books. I'm really delighted to be here with such a stellar panel of writers from this continent, from Singapore and from the United States. I'm joining this forum today from unceded Gadigal land, the land where I live and work. And I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, past, present and future, and the deep and vast tradition of custodianship and care for this country. So thrilled to have the opportunity to speak about this Rewriting Kinship essay series and to be able to draw out some of the ideas about kinship proposed in the 4 essays under discussion. Before I introduce you to the panelists, though, I want to step back a little bit and talk about how this series came into being. So I'm the editor of the Sydney Review of Books. Our interest is in publishing long-form criticism, and work, for want of a better name, goes under the term literary essays. Our interest is non-fiction, and so we have a natural affinity with the many kinds of practice supported by the non-fiction lab. The first series, co-commissioned by the SRB and the Non-Fiction Lab, got underway in that first very tense year of the pandemic. That was titled Powerful and Moving, and it was concerned with ideas about literary value at a time when we were all asking really new questions about the value of literature in times of crisis. And for that series, we found a model that we're using here again, one that paired an RMIT writer with an external peer, a peer out in the world, and we asked them to write a pair of essays that spoke to this theme of value. This was a pragmatic approach, in part driven by the odd structures of funding that we all work under, but it was one that allowed us to introduce an experimental component to the series and to recognise the ways in which ideas form in conversation, the way they ripple and recur across groups of work. So I'll pop a link for those of you who haven't seen those essays. I'll use the Q&A function to share a link to those essays. And that should come through. So what we saw, and I think what we published then, were not symmetrical pairs of essays that presented two opposing points of view, but a series of works that spoke to and spoke with each other. So this series, Rewriting Kinship, we started talking about in mid-2021. And that was a time when the pandemic was feeling extremely dreary indeed, particularly in Melbourne and in Sydney. We were all at home, and our relationships with those beyond our homes was almost exclusively mediated by screens. And the pandemic, with its lockdowns and border closures and Zoom meetings and 5-kilometre walking zones, this is the context for these essays. A context in which received notions of family, of connection, of care and identity all seemed up for grabs. And so when Julianne Van Loon proposed kinship as a focus for our series, it seemed utterly timely. And this model of paired essays, of essays in conversation with each other, seemed formally right as well. Oh, I'm not sure we've got a new screen up there. It's informally right as well. What we were asking writers to do was to enter into conversation, into a kind of relationship with each other, to think in relation as they explored ideas about kinship, what kinship can be and become. An RMIT writer would again connect with a writer of their choice to explore the theme. And I want to say their kind of writer, because kind and kin are etymological bedfellows, and because the first pair of essays that we published revealed the glorious generative power of language when it comes to imagining forms of kinship, to remaking kinship, to making kin and to recognising kin. So the first pair that we published was by Peter Murray and Francesca Rendle Short, and a companion piece by Ames Hawkins. This is an incredibly playful set of experiments that queer and trans kinship, and that revel in the kinship that the body detects through homophony, through alliteration, through tongue twisters, and the wordplay that reminds us that language can't be wrested from the body. And I'll pop links to all of these in the Q&A in a moment. And the second pair of essays that we published by Alfian and Sreedhevi are also deeply concerned with writing kinship. but also with the way that writers can be written into certain identities through the imposition of kinship. In the coming month or so, we'll publish essays by Rebecca Hill and Ryan Gustafson, and by Jessica Wilkinson and Miriam Wewelo and Alvin Pang. So there's a lot to say about these essays, much more than we can possibly fit into an hour. And I want to start by spending some time with Kin as Ethics by Peta and Francesca, and Kin as Ethics 2, if you can hear the exclamation mark there, by Ames Hawkins. And I'd like first to introduce our three authors. Once I've done these introductions, I'll be taking a big breath and handing over. So Peta Murray is a writer and performer known for her plays Wallflowering and Salt and her meaningfully irreverent and querulous approaches to performing the essay. A founding member of the Symphony of Awkward, she works with Dr. Kim Munro and Dr. Stacey Taylor on advances in dialogical arts and sciences. Her current projects include a book of essays, How to Dress for Old Age, with Professor David Carlin, a queer cantata, Heard, with Rect Allprods, and a co-edited collection on creative writing methods for Bloomsbury Academic. Peta's a recipient of numerous awards, including a Victorian Premier's Literary Award and a Centenary Medal for Services to Literature. She's a lecturer in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT. And Francesca Rendle Short is an award-winning novelist, memoirist and essayist. Her books include 2 anthologies of Asian, Pacific and Australian writing, The Near and the Far, Volume 1 and 2, published by Scribe, and the acclaimed novel cum memoir Bite Your Tongue, published by Spinifex. Francesca is Professor of Creative Writing in the School of Media and Communications at RMIT. She's co-founder of the fictionLab research group, and RICE, that's Writers' Immersion and Cultural Exchange. And finally, for our first grouping, Ames Hawkins is a transgenre writer and author of the award-winning work of literary nonfiction, These Are Love Letters. Named as one of the Chicago Guild Literary Complex's 30 Writers to Watch, their work appears in many edited volumes, and they're published across a range of scholarly and literary publications, such as Pretext, Constellations, Palava Journal, Enculturation, Slag Glass City, The Feminist Wire, The Rumpist, and Waterstone Review. Hawkins has been an invited curator at the Museum of Contemporary Photography and has exhibited work at the University of Buffalo, a professor of English and Creative Writing at Columbia College Chicago. They co-host and co-produced the podcast Masters of Text. And I'll pop the link for that into the Q&A in a moment. So our first essay, authored by Francesca and Peta, is titled Kin as Ethics. It's an incredibly playful piece, one that takes very seriously but also joyfully the project of writing kinship, of rewriting kinship, of bringing new ways of being in relation, new forms of connection into being through language. It announces itself as a work of kin thinking. This is a really startling, enabling pun full of possibility. So I want to invite Peta and Francesca together to read from this work and to tell us a bit about your process and about the collaboration that yielded this work and how it worked.
Thanks, Catriona, and hello from the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation, which is here in Nam. I've got a big grin on my face already and we haven't even started, but there's something about the thought of the process, of the practice behind this collaboration that fills me with joy, and revisiting the essays to prepare for today only underscored that. And in some ways, reading the essay to you would be more interesting in talking about it. But I would like to offer a little prologue before Francesca and I offer a first shared taster reading, just to give a little bit of a backstory to this essay of ours and the process that we went through to create it. It's been one of the most effortless pieces of creativity of my academic life. And it kind of tumbled out in its own strange way. And I think I've been thinking a lot about it recently and realised that the umbrella I would throw over it for me, for Francesca, and then later through inviting Ames into the playpen, is an idea that we were working in all kinessence together. And apologies for yet another bad pun before we've even got into the essay, but I think there was something about the opportunity to contribute a hybrid essay during the pandemic, the fact that I was already in this kind of playful headspace working on a blog that delivered a neologism a day, and then having this opportunity to experiment with the queer essay in a safe way with somebody that I admire and trust. These were the preconditions, I guess, for the creation of this first essay. And I don't underestimate, I think that the establishment of safe preconditions for practice, particularly for collaboration, is a really, really vital part of this story. So that's why I've taken a couple of moments to talk about that. And then, of course, we're dealing with this idea of ethics. So, of course, safety ethics are never far apart. I think that the two ideas sit very neatly with one another. So how did we do this? Well, we came up with this terrible pun, kinesthetics. And as we were in stuckness in the pandemic, as we were confined to our spaces and sent to our rooms, the idea of a kinesthetic practice seemed all the more enticing. We needed to move, we needed to flex ourselves in some kind of a way. So the title came first. Francesca and I talked about collaborating, and then blow me down if while I'm off busy teaching and trying to do all the stuff that I need to do, she doesn't let rip in a Google document and suddenly start to assemble this this thing. And it was in a series of chunks, and I remember she didn't show it to me. She just said, oh, I've started writing this thing, and here's the link to the Google document. And I thought, yeah, right, whatever. And before I knew it, Francesca had assembled a series of, I think there's a little joke actually early in the piece about the antiphonal, the tiffonal, the antiphonal. So a call and response kind of a work, but Francesca had made a series of calls, let's put it that way. She'd made a series of calls to me, and when I had time, using a practice that I'm quite dedicated to, which is a devotional or votive practice, I decided that for a subsequent run of 10 days, because I think there were 10 chunks, I would simply write a response to each of the calls that Francesca had made. So that's where it came from. That's probably enough. We had a Millernote board, we had the Google document, and then we had beautifully, thank you to Francesca, these little cues. And so it was a bit like playing with jazz, and you'll hear it as we read it. Francesca would give me a few notes to start with, and I would echo those notes and then take it into a kind of a jazz riff. So if Francesca will unmute, we will now do a reading from this, this essay, and it's a twinned reading. I amuse myself whenever lockdown is dropped over us, like a specimen jar entrapping bugs. I busy myself with tonight's bloggery, toying with posting pom-pom circumstance as my phrase of the day. Pom-pom circumstance puts wordage to the aureola of wattle blossom dot painting the landscape with artificial yellow, like something mixed by a paint chemist and spectrometry to make it pop. Pom-pom circumstance shakes ornamental tufts in your face, pointlessly pointillist pageantry, riotous rah-rah, to tell you that spring is coming in spite of it all, and kithing, a verb used in Scotland, now obsolete, kindredship, connection and renewal for all. Through kithing, one may announce, declare, proclaim affinity and hope. In kithing, one makes alliances known by action or by words, kindred spiritedness. Pom-pom circumstance cheerleads us lisping and louche into a new ethics of rococo-laboration.
Mary Capello tells us that language is our salvation. When I hear or say the word language, find it on my tongue, languaging there, it reminds me of lying back in a lounge suit in tulle and sequins, drapery and fur, frou-frou fabulous, twirling and redesigning, inserting and taking out, resentencing, making nouns do verb things, preposition do statement nouns, aroundness, beyondness, athwartness. rearranging and reimagining what comes before, what's coming after, substituting words for words, half sentences for quarters and thirds, what's on the cutting floor, embracing the mess, and stretching what Nicole Walker told me once were body verbs and reclaimed nouns, retrieving and reviving what's in our writerly DNA. Other words, making things up, acting out, languaging, tonguing.
Learning Gaelic helps me become the full Scots breakfast. For some reason, I have become possessed with a need to give expression to what I assume to be a lost part of my ancestry. I'm not talking Celtic cross tattoos, and I'm still iffy on the bagpipes, but give me the whiskey and the tartans and the eos agus buntata, fish and potatoes, and my wee border terrier doggies, and give me the Scottish country dancing and the reeling and the jigging and the midges and the locks and the glens and the glories of an endangered language that is all glottis and lenition, leads most sentences out with a verb, and does all kinds of bonkers things with gender. I sometimes wonder whether, if I was growing up now, if I had been born some decades later, would I have tossed my female identity into the Loch Ness of gender fluidity and thrown my she/her pronouns down the nearest well? I cannot say for sure, but I suspect I might have tried on non-binary for size even for a while. Am I allowed to say this? Am I allowed to think it? Would it be easier to say or think these thoughts in another language, in another body? I truly don't know. What I do know is that when I took up Scottish country dancing as a sport, as my hobby, as whatever it is I now pursue, I was taken aside early in the piece by one of the more proficient women and told in no uncertain terms that it would be a good 2 years before I would be allowed to be a man.
Learning Auslan helps me with prepositional thinking, queer thinking, kin thinking, kin thinking. Not only learning prepositions in Auslan using as such as near, between, through, inside, about, around, towards, shaping hands to follow up and over and across, but learning how to think differently, how to think spatially, diagrammatically, how to communicate with the body, how to shape hands in different ways, how to use facial expression, be demonstrative with the subtlety of variations, but sharp too, the precision required, flexibility, attention needed. You can't not look at who you are speaking to. You can't not express your face. That it teaches you about the ethics of relationships. It's a new understanding of kinship with a language that is passed from hand to hand. Okay, I'm going to just have a little break here before our next tiny little paired reading, just to talk a little bit about prepositions that pop up a lot in this work. I love prepositions, those little function words that we probably don't even think about. There are only 150 of them in the English language, and they're seen as a closed class, but I think that they're not closed at all in terms of possibilities and the way they can fly and fling about. And it also makes me think about what I like to think of as a prepositional ethics. Like, how do you do around? How do you do near? How do you actually come near and be near, entertain a kind of a nearness? How do you write beyond? How do you write towards? How do you write inside? And if we're thinking about that, then how does kin thinking think about writing into, inside, across, etc.? For me, it's a wonderful way, both in writing, but also in a kind of a metaphoric, figurative space, to think differently about relationships, about arrangements, different points of view. It allows me to listen, to breathe, to wait on the page, to look, to watch out. It gives me the language. And it was wonderful writing this essay with Peta, she and I in kinship in the writing of this work. allowing us to flutter and fly close and recognise and relish and floozy our way across the page. It was sensation. So we're just now going to read another little kind of twinning from this essay. I recognised her with a surge of joy, that person there, the front and centre butch, wide hip forward, the key rings, the belt, the buckle, the hands on the waist as hip, the check shirt, the gather of shirt across seam of breast, the double chin and pursed mouth, the bulk, eyes in a steady gaze. I didn't know, but I see. This idea of kin and recognition and joy, intra-queer recognition, Halberstam says, stranger recognition of kin, how we can think of kinship differently.
Will you think less of me when I tell you that one of my most joyful moments each evening is setting our fire? I have no defence. It's winter, we are in the nether regions, and we have a small cast iron firebox furnace kunara. It generates a generous warmth should we decide to light it. Fire setting is not always the precursor to fire lighting. Sometimes fire setting is satisfying enough. It is an art form.
Halberstam introduces me to the merographic method, which is built on an understanding of parts rather than wholes, that nothing can be described as a fixed whole because another might re-describe that whole in another way, a whole with same or different parts. That, to think of relations and connections, we need to recognise parts. In this way, Halberstam says, we should be attentive to the partial and arbitrary nature of all description and theory and the complex interactions between people and technology, human bodies and other non-human animal forms, scales and intensities. As I've said elsewhere, an inherent respect for the other is necessary in any ethical encounter.
Do not sweep out a firebox too regularly. Accumulating cold ashes in umpteen shades of grey make a good bed for the edifice one is about to build. First, the local newspaper, last week's and well read, scrunched into balls. A whole newspaper is not required. The paper is not a path, it is a mere signpost directing the flame to a nearby twig. Enter the kindling. Again, restraint, even parsimony, if you will. There is no need to arrange a tent of twigs if one divines among one's kindling stock, selects and arrays each stick carefully using only the most skeletal first and then upscaling. This is the only use I have ever had in my life for trigonometry, but there is something almost jigsaw-ish about the problem of the puzzle of the dispersal of the kindling so that each leans gently on its fellow.
I think of my own path through parts and kin, the ethics of queer seeing, bodies and anatomies, glossaries and glossums and glossa, and the day I first saw recognition and kin and almost missed the point because I didn't think I was one of them, because I didn't like dogs for a start and I didn't have the right boy haircut either, but I knew a late coming out postpartum, but a study of kin and kinship and kinning nonetheless, recognition, desire, want, the comfortable swag of the being and skin, the space these bodies occupied, the press of fingers and toes against the hairs on my skin, letters and words spelt out on my thighs, erotic tracery, the feltness of part proximity, amongness and betweenness, insides and outs, a prepositional awareness, and yes, surge of joy, fuck yes, the making of sugar shapes in my bloodstream, the redistribution and bringing together of parts, my chosen parts, oh glorious yes, and language to touch and touch and touch again and again.
It is like a game of pick-up sticks, but in reverse. A queer version whereby instead of taking sticks away, one adds them one by one from the slender to the thick, building a tilting tower of possibility for fire to crawl along, licking as it climbs. Here is kindling doing what it does best, leaning, propping, upholding, imminent in pre-ignition. Not yet alight, not yet aflame, but ready at any moment to be animated, roused and nurtured, as an animal might kindle its young.
Thank you.
All right, my effusions about those readings were caught while on mute. Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Peta. And so many of my questions about the essay are kind of answered in listening to your voices and hearing this piece in new ways. Now, I'm mindful of the time, so we're going to move on to Ames's companion piece. I won't try and advance a kind of a punning relationship here, because I think we are clearly in the hands of highly proficient practitioners. I want to turn to Kinner's ethics too, and Ames, you present this as your love letter to this collaboratively written essay, and I'd like to invite now you to read from your essay and to tell us about your process here, about your entry into relation, into a kind of prepositional relation, if you like, with the work of Peta and Francesca. And if you'd like to pick up on and elaborate on any of their comments, please do. To those of you in the audience, I should have said earlier, we've got the Q&A function set up here. So if there are questions you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A column to do so. And if we have time at the end of this very busy session, I hope we will, we'll come back to those. Come back to those questions. But if you want to notate your responses, please do so. Over to you, Ames. Thank you.
Hi. Good day, everyone. I'm coming to you from, I'm Ames, and I'm coming to you from the land of the three fires, Anishinaabe, the Ojibwa, Adawa, and Potawatomi people, in a city known by the settler name of Chicago. And I am thrilled to be here with you all. And all I want to do to sort of set this up is say that I was thrilled to be invited to do this work and to get to play with what they did. And I responded similarly. So I'm just gonna read a few pieces, bits of mine. And I think that you'll hear some of those same things picked up instead of kind of going through it any more than that. If we have time, we can talk about that afterward, if that sounds okay to everyone else. All right. I'm actually not going to read them in order though. Oh, okay. I'm going to do them in a little different order. Okay. Learning that you have been learning Auslan and Gaelic helps me imagine, by your generous prompting, the possibility for a language that brings together the gestural, the mathematical, and the ground. A queer Esperanto with a grammar, learnable in less than 1 hour, expressed through the iterative repetition of syntactical emotions that never repeat, a phenomenological calculation of the power of the erotic in queer time and space. Quispanto, quiranto, glissando, whatever it is, I know in my heart and soul, it will be developed by and through the life breath of and within dance. Not all or any dance, of course, but the dancing queers do, both in critical mass as well as free radical raves of one. Not the dance that happens in a club with other queers, but all manner of fleshly expression that invites twirling, whirling, dipping, spinning, sliding, striding, and voguing as syntactical strategies for refamiliarizing spoken and unspoken connections with and to queer desire. Dance that happens regardless of physical ability in any culture and any time zone across the globe. Exuberant corporal expression that transforms familiar rejection, cultural discrimination, and social exclusion experienced by individual queer and trans folks into the ecstatic discovery of one's body as home. I come back to the point, to the doing, to the application of ideas, processual thoughts, the method, the long way around, by way of thinking about mathematics as language. Signs and symbols and meanings parallel to speech that pulse as a series of nodes, noting what may stand in for what may act exponentially expand when we refigure the subject, when we prepositionally substitute, when my relationships might be ever in transition as I move them from above to around, into, below, upon, and through. Consider this. 5 factorial is both 128 and the number 5 exclaimed. It is both the number of a gallon of ounces in a gallon of milk and the child at their birthday party beaming with delight, able to answer that ever predictable question with a fully extended hand, this old. Fully extended hands that hold remind me of my hands that held the hands of 3 other humans now grown. 3 who were born of 2 different wombs, 2 different seed givers. If we were to figure in terms of individual humans with respect to years, we might say there's a rough calculation of 3 factorial times 23 times 27 times 32 ways for them to refer to themselves and me and their relationship with and to each other. Example, 3 factorial times 1 times 6 times 10 equals queer spawn, which is the term eldest child once used more than 20 years ago to explain who they were in relationship to the world. And it's interesting, I'm going to end with the final section, which ended up being, it's very interesting to me. When I wrote this, my eldest child was pregnant, and this was published, I can't remember the date, I think just after she was born. She was born on March 25th. Anyway, they had a welcoming ceremony and wanted the grandparents to speak and say something. I was like, I don't know what I would say. What do you know? I have something ready to go. So thank you for inviting me to write this, because then this allowed me to have something to say at our welcoming service. What there is to relish in the closing of any love letter is the way it feels to write toward an imagined recipient with whom you are connecting in this now, which also exists in a parallel there then. An imagined I for an eye, for an eye, for an eye, for an eyelet, for an inlet, leading to a shared and sacred trans-substantive creative imagining of folding and unfurling these responses into yours. What there is to relish as I stare out at gently falling snow is an image of meeting the first grandchild not yet born. She, as has been announced by her parents, will appear sometime near the end of March. What do you want to be called? Her parents ask. Poppy, I say. I will be Poppy. Poppy for my own pop-up, who I will always adore for starting stories about his own childhood when I was a little girl. Poppy for the vivid red flower signifying both death and rebirth, as well as the crepe paper versions my pop-up would hang from his rearview mirror twice a year after donating to the veterans of foreign wars. Poppy that reverberates with the endearment of Pappy, the sensation of being springy and bouncy and ready for fun. Poppy as kin, as one of a kind, as committed to sharing care as a foundation of queer ethics dedicated to expanding our conception of family blood. I imagine myself becoming Poppy, a long process that begins when I first hold the wee babe and whisper softly a solemn bow. Welcome to the world, new one. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm your Poppy. Your mommy and daddy are here to care for you, to take care of you. And I know they will, but I am your Poppy. I am here to take care with you, to learn about who you are and what you love so I may share and delight in the wild wonders of whoever it is you are in order to do whatever I can to help you become in this world. When I imagine whispering to the child, I am your Poppy, I am committing myself to a relationship of care with them, as well as with the earth and all its beasts and waters, mountains, and plants. When I imagine myself signing cards and letters to the child with all my love, your Poppy, I am writing myself into a future where I have let go of this need to explain anything or be understood by anyone. When I first hear you declare, this is my Poppy, I will transmogrify yet again through the sound of my name on your tongue. I will have birthed the new self, as dust, as dancing, as corporal text. Thanks.
Thank you, Ames. Thank you so much. I remember that suite of emails around the time of publication. I had no idea that we were so close, and it's such a gift. The essay itself, and very moving to hear you read that now. Thank you very much. I think I'd like to move to Sri and Alfian's essays now, who approach this topic of kinship quite differently. And this is part of the pleasure and the provocation of a series like this for me, in that we have a theme, and the theme becomes more elaborate, more complex, and richer as different writers approach it through their own practice. And as we accumulate a group of essays on remaking kinship, we remake the idea itself. So I'd like you to introduce you first to Alfian and to Sri before inviting them to read and talk a bit about their work and about their process. So I'm really delighted to welcome Alfian Sat to this reading. He is the resident playwright of Wild Rice. His published works include 3 collections of poetry: One Fierce Hour, A History of Amnesia, and The Invisible Manuscript, a collection of short stories, Corridor, a collection of flash fiction titled Malay Sketches, 3 collections of plays, as well as the published play Cooling Off Day. In 2001, Alfian won the Golden Point Award for Poetry, as well as the National Arts Council Young Artist Award for Literature. His plays and short stories have been translated into German, Swedish, Danish, and Japanese. Many of you will know Sri Iyer, who was shortlisted for the SBN Book of the Year prize in 2021 for her terrific novel, The Tiniest House of Time. She's also been nominated for the Penang Monthly Book Award in 2017 for her collection of stories, Jungle Without Water and Other Stories. She's been shortlisted twice for the Pushcart Prize, and her works have appeared in publications around the world, including in Sweden, Italy, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, the US, the UK, and more. She's resident in Melbourne. Now, these 2 essays grapple with the way categories and labels create forms of identity and suggest kinships, and they're particularly interested in what this means for writers. And I would like to invite each of you, both of you, Alfian and Sri, to reflect on the way identity works in these essays and in your broader thinking, and works to imply or impose relationships of kind or kin. I'm really interested in the ambivalences your essays track about writing within these categories. We'll start with Sri, whose essay published on Monday dramatises the push and pull of identity, of being named kin to others through categorisation. So Sri, I invite you to read a short extract to begin with and talk us through what I think this essay presents as the paradoxes of kinship.
Thank you, Catriona. Thank you so much. And it's so great to have everyone here. Thank you for this. Yes, just very quickly, I mean, Alfian, I've known Alfian for so many years now, but it's always been in very different ways. And this is the first time that I think we've actually collaborated creatively together. We've known each other as members of a tribe before. And I found it very interesting because because of lockdown and because of the pandemic, we've pretty much been doing this via Zoom. And interestingly, one of the things that really called out to me was that every time I Zoomed with Alfian, his background was of this huge theatre, which is clearly his oeuvre, and somehow that seemed to really affect me as we kept chatting. And we kept looking at the ideas of what is it that we were wanting to write about? What is it that sometimes we thought we could write about, but we had to be careful about writing out because of who we were, and that we had certain similarities of being, functioning as writers who were minorities in our environments, and yet, was that a good thing? Was that a bad thing? It meant certain things were clear that we could write about, but maybe certain other things were not very clear whether we could or not. And I think both our essays sort of grew out of that kind of overlap and that kind of ambiguity over what can we write, are we writing what other people are expecting us to write versus are we writing what we actually do want to write. I also think we are probably slightly different in our positions on this. I think Alfian might have a slightly different take on this, but I was very happy to find that when our essays came out, there were these sort of subconscious overlaps that were already there. So I think we're actually more similar than we were caring to admit to each other, which I thought was really interesting. So my excerpt really quickly comes quite deep into the essay where I'm looking at where we are in these sort of culture wars, but I'm sort of looking at thinking of how it influences what one is able to write, or what one feels one is no longer able to write, in a way, looking at perhaps a narrowing of the discourse in our current global literary scenario. So I'll quickly get into that, and then I'd be happy to see what Alfian has to say as well. What we seem to have lost in the culture wars is proportion. David Goldberg has been pleading for it when speaking of the inculcated culture of calling out anti-Semitism, making the case that the position of the Jewish individual on the global stage is far more successful and acculturated than in any other period in history. Walid Ali finds the reason for the disproportionate measures between registering offense and the punishment of it mired within a critical social justice theory worldview, where no act or word is too small to be considered part of systemic oppression. He wrote in 2020, and I quote, "When nearly everything can be found problematic, when labels like white supremacists can be hurled at most social behavior and people, they flatten out the very idea of oppression," unquote. We also seem to have lost a sense of who the cultural enemy is, going for those among us as opposed to those outside of us. It is not the ultra right-wing white nationalist who is getting cancelled online or in real life. It instead seems to be those who hold the same values, occupations, and political standpoints: the writers, the musicians, the artists, the publishers, the university professors. It is a loss of, as Stephen Fry writes, a sense of who is truly the perpetrator of the prejudice. I quote, "Just as it happened in 1917 after the Russian Revolution, and just as it happened with Luther after the Inquisition, it's not the enemies that the zealots destroy, it's their allies. And it's not the enemies of racial equality, gender equality, sexual equality, the general believers in diversity, the believers in making the world a fair and better place. They're the ones who get their asses kicked," unquote. Apart from the obvious concern here regarding systemic prejudice within the structures of power in literary discourse, what also emerges is the question of the effect that all this might have on an author's craft. While the utopian ideal may be to facilitate equality and discrimination, self-censorship causes problems before the work is even created. When any author, including this one, has to produce art in an unbalanced, skewed environment, the tendency might be to lean towards the safe, the veering away from what's perceived as harmful, never mind by whom and to whom, the unambiguous, the unsubtle, and therefore the uninteresting. In a global literary reality where mouths can be banned from schools for nudity and violence that have been grossly decontextualized away from its intended effect of horror at the Holocaust into horror by the Holocaust, what work will be created? Is calling out the only legitimate lens? Is the allowance for interpretation perhaps emerging as the new taboo? My concerns here are in alignment with fears that Chimamanda Adichie expressed to Jon Favreau in a recent podcast interview, and I quote, "I think the literary arts produced in the US in the next 10 or 15 years, unless something changes, will be awful. I think it will be flat. I think the characters will be terrible mouthpieces, because what's happening now is people are afraid. I really think that people are afraid of not just writing about certain subjects, but how they write about them. I think art has to be able to go to a place that's messy, a place that's uncomfortable. You have to be able to write characters who are assholes," unquote. I might leave it there for now. Thank you.
All right. Now, there's a little bit of background chat here about whether everybody can see all of the panelists, but I very much hope that you're able to see, and particularly to hear Alfian, who I want to invite into the discussion now. I'm doing so slowly because I hope we're all in order. But I love your piece, Identity Alphabetically, which is literally a list of nouns. It's an alphabet's worth of nouns that have something to do with kinship and identity, with your own identity even, and yet each item in this list comes up against its own limits very, very quickly. And I really love the way this piece enacts its argument at the level of form. So I want to invite you now to read a short extract and to reflect with Sri and the other panelists on these paradoxes of identity and kin making.
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much for inviting me on this panel. It has been such a delight listening to all of you read from your essays. I will just jump in. So I think what Catriona said in the beginning about imposed kinships, right? So that's something that I did feel very acutely as a writer as well as a reader when I encounter certain characters and certain representations, the kinds of relationships that I think I'm supposed to have with them because of a shared cultural background is something that I've always been grappling with. So I will jump straight into my essay to give you a sense of that. So my essay is written alphabetically, so the entries, I'm going to read the entries G, H, and I. So G is for gaze. The primitive Malay, however, is not just a white people problem. In 1950, Wang Gangwu published a poem called Ahmad from his collection Pulse. In the poem, Wang writes about a Malay man called Ahmad, probably the most common name for Malay men. It begins with the line, Ahmad was educated, and one detects a critique of colonial education designed to produce peons and functionaries, but not anyone educated enough to challenge the ruling order. Here's an excerpt. Thoughts of comfort fading, contentment creeping in. Allah has been kind, orang putih has been kind. Only yesterday his brother said, can get lagi satu wife lah. Let's get the glosses out of the way. Camphor is a portmanteau for Cambridge and Oxford. Orang putih is white men, and can get lagi satu wife lah means can get another wife. As Ahmad settles into his clerical job and enjoys his material perks, he starts to see his colonial masters not as a source of oppression, but beneficence. He becomes less ambitious, or rather reorients his ambitions towards other pursuits, like polygamy. While I understand the poem to be about colonial miseducation, I cannot help but bristle at the details. The image of the Malay as indolent and easily contented, supposedly blessed with tropical bounty and therefore unused to hard work, has long been a feature of colonial writing. Their lethargy is often contrasted against the energy and dynamism of Chinese and Indian migrants who are willing to labor in tin mines and rubber plantations in the service of colonial capitalism. Here's an excerpt from another poem by another pioneer poet, Edwin Tambu, from his 1977 collection Gods Can Die. Incidentally, it is also called Ahmad. He is the son of the soil who roves the outskirts of our jungle. He is our brother who moves with the sun so easily. Still, his eyes have strange fires. In the poem, Ahmad is painted as someone seething with communal rage. It is Malay nationalism that has fired him up and caused him to lay the blame for his suffering on colonial exploitation, on dispossession by the Chinese and Indians. Ahmad is a primordialist, and the narrator, who is not Malay, indulges in anguished hand-wringing, essentially asking, can I be friends with this person who thinks I've stolen from his people? H is for history. Lazy native, angry native, backward native. When I first started to write, the question was not so much what to write about, but what to write against. There was a history I was up against, and the only moral and political response to that was a counter-history. Ahmad will have to speak for himself. I for identity. But who is Ahmad? In Singapore, the Malays are often portrayed in the mainstream press as a problem minority. A joke I make about my community, the degraded. Headlines often mention drugs, highest percentage of abusers, divorce, highest rates, and diabetes, highest rates as well. Depressed, in the doldrums. So Ahmad will be someone who does not take drugs, is not divorced, and is not diabetic. That's a start. But what kind of start is this? Before I've even written the first word, has the text already arrived dead at its didactic destination? Thank you.
Thanks, Alfian. Thank you so much. Look, if I were a more didactic chair, or maybe a more tyrannical chair, I would just sternly tell the panelists that they all needed to stay for another 45 minutes and expect everybody in the audience to do so too. But you know, I'm not. So we're going to try and wrap this up by 1:30. And what I'd like to do as we close is to invite, and I say this knowing that we all have a great deal to say to each other, but invite the panel to reflect on this tension between categorization and forms of kinship categories and creative freedom. I'm so glad, Alfian, that you chose that section to read, because I think it draws out that tension beautifully. It seems to me that the kinesthetics pair of essays each enact a mode of exaltatory liberation from categorization, and they do so without diminishing the very real restrictions placed on the lives and joy of queer and trans people. And similarly, you know, while Sri and Alfian's essays are kind of pushing against restrictions, they do so in a way that's extremely cheeky rather, and subversive and generative. So I invite you to reflect on how rewriting kinship can form new bonds and attachments and can support creative freedom. I'm going to look into my screen to see who's most enthusiastic to take up this question. Who would like to take this one up first? Peta.
Not really. I think we've all gone all shy now and in our little boxes. And I guess all I want to say is how expansive the paradoxes seem to me to be in the work that Ames and Francesca and I have done. The kind of the slipperiness, the slippages have given us a kind of a freedom to, it's almost like to unwrite our identities in some way, or to allow our positionalities to be relaxed in a way that we very rarely get to experience. And I guess in engaging with Sri and Alfian's work, there's that same playfulness, and there's that same kind of understanding of what containers words can be, and what agility one needs to kind of slip out of the containers that are so readily offered to us by our cultures or by otherings that are practiced upon us. So that's all I'd like to say.
Sri, I know this is a real preoccupation of your essay. I wonder if you'd like to chime in here.
Yes, thank you, Catriona. I thought it was really interesting, even with the essays by Francesca and Peta as well, how there's this sort of openness to experimentation. I've got some notes here, and experimenting with the heritage. Peta, I'm thinking of your Scottish dance classes, sorry, and also pushing it towards, an artistic practice that contemporary, and that's for the now. So sort of taking the past and bringing in the present, sort of clashing it together. And I thought that was really interesting. And in terms of thinking of kinship, and yes, that you know, I am preoccupied with this idea of, you know, are the parameters of what can and can't be written, are they narrowing, are they expanding, are they just transforming into something else? One of the things that I've always thought of or sort of come up with when I think of kinship is that I would much rather consider a kinship that's based on a commonality of skill or talent or a passion, for example, in the writing, which we're all doing, as opposed to a kinship that's based on a group identity. It's not to say that I'm disparaging of that group identity. It's just, I think maybe there is an order of how I consider myself as a writer, and the group identity is in that order, but it's a lot lower in the rung than perhaps the conversation around it is. You know, I see more as myself. You know, my tribe is a different tribe first, and the focus is on the craft first, and that's where the kinship comes in before the rest of it. So that's kind of my take on that, which is probably why I'm preoccupied with this in the first place. But
other panelists, would you like to, by way of closing the session, reflect on this relationship between creative freedom and kinship? Francesca, you're leaning in that telltale.
I just want to say, you know, just a brief comment that the very space that you've created, Catriona, in the Sydney Review of Books allows for this wonderful, what I think of multiplicity. So when I think about kinship, it's about multiple and generative, and you know, when I think of Ames talking about Poppy at the end, I found that so moving. This kind of popping up of Poppy because of this grandchild being born, but then popping into this essay as this kind of new thinking. And then when I think about you describing the other essays on their way into this space, demonstrating another kind of multiplicity. So I've got a sort of like a body that's got many things attached to it, and it's wonderful. So I just wanted to thank you for this opportunity to speak and to write in this way, and it's wonderful to be here with Sri and Alfie.
Oh, thank you, Francesca. And it's certainly my intention to expand these categories rather than adjudicate them or find the right line on kinship. And I'm very grateful to writers who are willing to accept what I often, you know, fear is a very loose brief and an invitation to just go off and do the thing that you want to do rather than, you know, satisfy this template. I was also very grateful, Peta, for your reflections right at the beginning of this session on what the safe conditions for practice are and the safe conditions for writing kinship, for rewriting kinship, for meeting other writers and for meeting audiences. It's something that I reflect upon a great deal, and I'm grateful to you for drawing attention to that. I think this is 1:29 where we're going to wrap this session. My really sincere thanks to Ames, to Francesca, to Peta, to Sri, and to Alfian. I wish we did have like 2 follow-up sessions, but that can't be. Thank you to everybody who's joined us. If you haven't read these essays, please do, and please reread them. The next public forum will take place on the 5th of October. You'll see all the details for that on your screen. And just finally, while I'm here, thank you so much for Julian Van Loon and David Carland for supporting this initiative and being such troopers for the essay. Thanks all.